Welcome to Kingdomize, the podcast, where we discuss how to see our lives and our world through a kingdom lens, how to infuse kingdom culture into our families, our workplaces, and our cities, as we all participate in the dream of Jesus to see his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.
So welcome back to Kingdomize, the podcast. This is going to be fantastic. It will. I know that because it's always fantastic, but this will be fantasticer, like even more fantastic than normal, because I am here with my good friend Ian Green. I'm Brian Beatty, but we have Lois Gott with us today. A few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago, we had Ken Gott, Lois's husband, and he said, "Why are you talking to me? You need to talk to my wife, man. She's like taking over the north of England. It's amazing." Only he said it really nicer because he has an accent, and I just say it in my Canadian, whatever I have. So, but we are really excited to be here. We're still in our Solutionaries series. We're still talking about people with real stories, with a real God, bringing solutions from heaven to earth, almost like Jesus said, his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And so Lois is here today. Lois and Ken have been heroes of the faith for many years. Not just in England and not just in Sunderland where they live, but all over the globe with the way they've touched hearts through revival back in the 90s through till today. And now they've moved beyond revival. Well, we're going to talk about that. Moved beyond revival. And revival is good, but we move beyond into something else, not at the expense of, but there's more. And so, Lois, it is such a pleasure to be with you. You're one of my You're one of my favorite people on the whole planet. So the fact that you would come and hang out with us is just amazing. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
So nice to have you. And Ian, you know a bit more of the background of the family there. So why don't you give a little bit of the background of England and the background with the Gotts and Lois, and then we'll get into the story.
So I probably knew of Lois's dad before I got to know Lois. So her dad, Herbert Harrison, he was a very well-known pastor, preacher from Newcastle for many, many years, innovative, creative. How he reached into the city. Bus evangelism was one of the things that he used, which was an eye-opener for the British community. And so there's always been a tremendous admiration for me for the Harrison and now, of course, the Gott, the Gott family. And I guess as things began to break out in Sunderland in the 90s, I had an appetite. I couldn't just, I just couldn't observe from a distance. I had to go and get dunked, get into the flow of what was going on, and ended up there 3 or 4 days. And Ken invited me around in between the meetings to his home, and although we had kind of known of each other, that was a really a close connection. And then we both, all of us got involved with Transform Our World with Ed Silvoso, found ourselves at conferences together in different parts of the world, suffering. But Jesus, in Hawaii, it was difficult. It was difficult, but we did it anyway. And so for me, this is, and probably in the last year or so, I've reconnected more closely with Ken. And so I'm hearing the incredible things that's going on through the life of Lois. So I said to Brian, Brian, Ken's okay, but we really got to get Lois. We got to get Lois on, because it's going to be absolutely ballistic. So Lois, thank you for coming. Can't wait. Gonna prod you because I know we probably we'll need 7 hours, but we've got about 40 minutes. I
was going to say I'll try and condense it because there's quite a story and it all molds in together. But, you started with my dad. I grew up a pastor's daughter, but actually I was one of these pastor's daughters that was quite damaged by the fact that, as a pastor's daughter, you're under constant scrutiny by people, and judgment, in the environment, the legalistic environment that I grew up in, as it was then. And so, I always say that the church was like, I watch people in this nation, they're football fanatics, especially in the north of England. And so I can be in a room and there's a whole load of men, and there might be all sorts of shapes and sizes and fitness levels, but they are shouting at the men on the pitch who are kicking the ball, why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you do it that way? And actually, that's how the church was for me. It was full of people who were sitting there making judgment about my dad. And he was my dad, and I loved him. And I can remember the feeling of, well, it's only because she's the pastor's daughter to do this, or, it happened on my wedding day. It was a very hot day. I'd drunk a lot, and I needed to use the bathroom before I went in, and I squeezed in a cubicle with this dress on and everything. And two ladies came in, and I heard one of them say, they're going to present her with a Bible today. And the other one say, yeah, it's only because she's the pastor's daughter. Who does she think she is? And I remember walking up the aisle, and it's part of the story, to make my vows to Ken, but I was making inner vows, and it was, I will never be involved in church. I'm never going to be involved in the ministry. God, it's too painful. It's too much. I do not want people looking at my life and passing judgment. And that was very, very real. And I was safe. I managed a fingerprint. I married a fingerprint expert. You might not know. He was the youngest fingerprint expert in the country, qualified to give evidence at Crown Court. And we married. And I was able to keep Ken very nominal. We sat at the back. We kept ourselves distant. We didn't get involved in small groups, anything like that. And then my dad persuaded us to go on a camp holiday, all the young people. We were married and we had very young children. And I was very good at, looking after the children and avoiding church services and everything like that. I was able to keep on the outskirts. And Ken went off, and he came back that night. He had a lot of hair then, you'll be surprised to know. And it was stood on end. It was all over the place. His eyes were red from crying. I took one look at him and I knew what had happened. And it was like my whole world fell apart.
Wow.
And he said to me, we need to go and have a little chat. Because he knew where I was. He knew my problems, everything. And so we walked around that campsite, hand in hand, and he said, Lois, God called me to the ministry tonight. And I've told God, I'll give him everything. I'll serve him. If it costs my career, if it costs our home, whatever it costs, I have made that vow to God. And I was crying. I was saying, how could you do this? You know how I feel. I remember going home. I can remember doing the ironing, and I didn't need a steam iron because the tears were so much. And I was saying, God, I can't do this. And actually, you need to know the levels of fear that came. Just I cannot live this life that I grew up in now. And, I'm going to be really personal. I'm talking to you, but I'm deciding to get very personal. I actually, Ken took on a small house group, and it went from 5 little old ladies to nearly 100 people squashed in our house, young people, just up the stairs. The growth was phenomenal. I was still not getting involved. And so my dad says, I'm going to plant a church in Sunderland with you, Ken. Just ignoring my lack of participation. and Ken said yes. And we began that, and my dad was helping him plant it. And actually, my fear drove me. And I used to see, I had 2 daughters, Ken and I. We had a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I watched mothers with babies didn't have to get really involved. And it was, very easy to persuade Ken, Ken, I've always wanted to increase the family. We need, be great to have another baby. I'm desperate, but actually the underlying motive was that I might opt out of any requirement of me as a pastor's wife.
Wow.
I couldn't be like my mother. I wasn't somebody who counselled or whatever. And, I was happily pregnant straight away, got right up until the due date. It was Christmas. The baby was due at Christmas. It was the 18th of December. Went to bed that night and I woke up with the familiar pains. I actually thought my waters had broken. But when we put the light on, actually the bed was covered in blood. And I was rushed to hospital with Ken. And during the labour, the doctor took my hand. And I said, where's Ken? I was holding this doctor's hand, thinking I was holding Ken's hand. And he said, he's out in the corridor. The registrar's having to talk to him. And he said, I need you to be very brave now. He said, your baby just died and you're going to have to deliver this child. And we're ready to deliver now. But things have gone really wrong and it's the only way we can do this. And so Ken came back in the room and I remember crying and saying, have they told you? He said, yeah, they've told me. And then our son was born, like immediately. Perfect baby. Matthew, gift of God, full term, beautiful child, nothing wrong with him. And then the agony of that. And as they passed him over for me to hold and look at, I began to hemorrhage profusely. My kidneys failed, my liver failed.
Wow.
I was dying. The last thing I remember, they said to Ken, we need to get a priest. Your wife's not going to make it. And I remember hearing him saying, I'm one. And I remember them saying blood pressure. I remember hearing them saying 50 over 30 and she's slipping. And that scripture came to mind. I've given you power over all the power that the enemy possesses, physical and mental, strength and ability, so that nothing shall harm you. And long story short, my life was spared, but my health was impaired. Kidneys, I spent the next 3 years in and out of the Freeman Hospital, the kidney unit there, severe high blood pressure. I was very sorry for myself and broken. But recognizing that also my strategy to avoid the call of God had taken us into absolute brokenness in my life, despair. Ken was brand new in the ministry. He has this wife that's in hospital all the time. I mean, 3 years, basically, raising the girls on his own. It was really difficult. And then into our lives blows a woman called Suzette Hatting. My dad had Suzette Hatting come to preach.
Wow.
And she did a night with all the elders and the ministers, and she singled Ken out and she said, where's your wife? Well, we've just lost a baby. She's very sick. She couldn't come tonight. And she said, I didn't know why God had sent me in here and given me permission. It was at the height of the Crusades in Africa with Reinhardt, when she was leading those prayer meetings that were phenomenal. She said, but God sent me just for you and your wife. She said, put her in the car tomorrow and make her come.
Wow.
And so when Ken came home and told me, I was absolutely so upset with him for telling her all the story, and he did what you said. He made me go the next day. And she took my hand, and to be quite honest, she really hurt me and insulted me, because she looked at me, took my hand, she said, did your heart hurt? when your baby died? And I said, what an appalling question to ask a mother who's just lost a baby, who's struggling in and out of hospital. She said, Lois, the Father's heart hurts like that every time you abort his plan for your life by running away. And it was like those words. And I broke, and she said, Lois, the Father has a call. Your Heavenly Father has a call on your life. And she didn't know the backstory of how it felt or anything. She just said, you have aborted his plan for your life, and he's grieving over that. And she prayed with me, and she took me to the scriptures of Hannah. And she said, verse 7, the Bible says, Hannah was dwelling in a nice double portion from her husband, keeping her nice and comfortable. But it then says, and Hannah stood up. She said, I've come across the world to tell you, God is saying, Lois, stand up. Her words actually grabbed me. I repented to the Lord for the fear. I repented for running. I reconsecrated my life. And for the first time, Ken had his wife beside him in the ministry. And I remember saying, God, I ran from the call. Now I'm in it, and I'm struggling for my health. Long story short, I had miraculous intervention from God, where God touched my kidneys, and I've walked in great health, but with a limp ever since. And that brokenness, I remember just, there was many things I couldn't do. My legs were like tree trunks. I was so swollen with the kidneys not working. I was in hospital, and I was desperately broken from the loss of a son that I longed for. And somebody gave me a Vineyard tape, and we, Assemblies of God, we weren't into Vineyard music at all. But there was a song, Your Presence Here is the answer to the longing of my heart. You are here, and I behold your glory. And that's what breaks me. I always say that's where God found me, and I found him in intimacy, in a relationship that for me has been the motivation and the stamp of my life, in that brokenness of a lost child. And so there's a little gravestone in a graveyard near here, and it says, Matthew Gott, your life produced revival.
Wow.
Because that brokenness, in those couple of years, I began to lead prayer, supervised by Suzette, who would fly in and out of the country. And we don't talk about it, but I'm going to tell you, we had angelic visitation, unbelievable. And we didn't say, because we didn't want people to come to hear angels. But it was an extraordinary time. And for 3 years, I stood up. Didn't matter what my blood pressure was. Didn't matter what the physical. And I'm not advocating people do that. It was what God was telling me to do. And I led prayer. But that brokenness to Ken and I paved the way for you see, God uses broken vessels. It wasn't that we were moving up a ladder of success. It wasn't that we were even crying for revival. We were just two broken people who had a new intimacy with the Father and a love for Jesus that we'd never had before.
Wow.
It was everything.
Wow.
And so, you know the story. On a trip to Toronto, God came. He came to our church. We had about 100 people on a Sunday morning. Within a week, we had 1,000 people every night trying to get in. We had people on deck chairs queuing up to get in. We had the Pizza Hut running out of dough and having to close early. We had 3 years solid of meetings like that. And then Ken and I began to travel the world. And on one of those trips, I was staying with a very famous couple. I won't mention who, but a very, very well-known servant of the Lord, and his wife and I were sitting in the bedroom, and she was actually pouring her heart out in all the struggles she was going through in her marriage and in her life and in everything. And she said, there's a prophet. There's a prophet coming to there's a prophet coming to the Winter Park. And she said, let's go and hear what she has to say. And I went, and I actually thought, please forgive me if you're American. I thought, how gullible are these Americans? This woman, she was just giving out words. And then she said, you two ladies at the back. She didn't recognize the lady. And she then proceeded to tell us everything we'd been saying in the bedroom before we left.
Wow.
And she said, come out, I need to pray for you. And then she prayed over me, and she began to tell the life story of everything I've told you. And she said, right at this minute, your husband is looking over plans to build a building. And, cut a long story short, she was the one that prophesied the building that the revival came to. And because of that, in 1996, we invited her back to come and do a prophetic conference in the middle of the move of God that was happening. She brought with her a whole 40-odd people from America that were television ministries and all sorts of, to visit the move of God. And on the first night, she got me to stand up. I'm 40 years old, and she said, God is going to give you, you think you're in a new thing now. So you're asking, how did you get into the kingdom? And she said, you think you're in a new thing now, this move of God, but the new thing's to come. A sign of which a baby will be put in your arms. And that baby will be a sign. Well, I went home and I said, Ken, this woman doesn't know the pain we've gone through. Which she doesn't know we can't have another baby. She doesn't know we're far too old to adopt. Nobody in this country is going to let us have a baby. Who, and not only that, it's just too awkward. And Ken said to me, she must mean a spiritual baby. We're going to have a spiritual baby. So on the Sunday morning, it was a women's conference, so she'd got me that night. On the Sunday morning, she's speaking to the whole church, and she says to Ken and I, could you both stand up? So we did. And she said, Ken, God wants you to know this is not a spiritual baby. An actual baby is going to be put in your arms. So Ken and I decided that this woman was deluded and it wasn't a word from God. And 5 years later, that minister's wife who'd been in the bedroom with me, she was over with us doing a women's conference, and I was approached by an American lady who had been raised by Derek Prince, one of his people, who was living in a nearby city, and they were running food kitchens for the homeless, etc. And she came up to me and she said, I was in that service where that prophet said to you, a baby would be put in your arms. She says, we've got a young woman who walked into our homeless feeding. She's a young woman with 5 children. She's only 24. She works in the streets. She's a drug addict. She was raped by a man on day release from prison who had murdered at 16, and he'd served his sentence, and he took her and held her captive, raped her, and she's pregnant. Maybe this is the baby. Would you be willing to enter this? This couple from America had adopted so many children themselves, etc. And I went home. I remember going home and saying again, and he was saying this, we're 45 now, bear in mind. And he's saying, oh, Lois, no, this is just not possible. It's crazy. you know, but at the same time, that word had stuck there. You're going to move into the new thing. And so we said, well, yes, we'll meet her. We'll talk to her. Which we did. We met this young woman who had walked in. And here, I'll tell you this bit of the story. She'd been in an abortion clinic where the social services had taken her. And she was about to go in for the abortion. And she had a full-on vision of Jesus sitting on a rock. And all around him were little lambs. And we didn't know this when I get to another part of the story. And he said, don't go ahead with this abortion. I have a purpose for this baby. And he picked up a little lamb with broken legs. And he said, this baby is the lamb with broken legs. And so she came and said, I can't go ahead with it. She said, I need this baby to be adopted. You can't just decide I want this couple to adopt my baby. You can't, I mean, there's lots of stuff. To cut a long story short, the social services department was supporting her. They decided they would look at us. They sent a very, very senior social worker who's called a guardian to do a home study on Ken and I. Her name was Mary Shepherd. She did the full assessment on us, and they decided to go through legal rather than social services. And the judge awarded us a guardianship of this baby when it was going to be born.
Wow.
And I was in the labour room, bearing in mind the last time I had been in a labour room, my baby had died. And here I am, where the prophet 5 years earlier had said, the new thing will come when a baby's put in your arms. And I'm sitting there in a labour room, and this young woman of a broken life, she was broken. She herself had been raised in the care system. She gave birth to this baby, and the midwife said, where would you like the baby? Do you want to hold the baby? Do you want the baby on your chest? And she said these words, no, put the baby in Lois's arms, because she is going to be her mother. And the social services department supported the whole process. 3 hours later, I left the hospital with that baby, Ken and I, which was a miracle in itself. We absolutely loved this baby that God had given us. It was restoration. It was so miraculous. We knew that God was in it. It was also fulfillment of the word, a baby will be put in your arms.
Wow.
For the new thing. And it was like, what is the new thing? You know, and then as she grew, when she reached about, well, from the beginning, she was exceptionally intelligent, highly verbal, but was on the go all the time. She could have explosion. When she reached 5, we knew this child isn't quite like the children we've raised before. When she reached 7, she was diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder, but highly functioning and incredibly intelligent, but very autistic in her thought. And between the ages of 5 and 11 were some of the most difficult years I've ever gone through, because her behaviour was so out there, and she herself was in distress. And you know, for her sake now I won't go into it, but it was actually to the point where, is the family going to survive this? And I remember sitting in the garden actually and crying and saying, God, what are you doing? I lost a baby. you gave me a baby that you promised, and yet this baby, I'm not going to see her get married. I'm not, this is a dreadful thing. I don't know how life's going to be. I cannot tell you how difficult life actually was for Ken and I for years. And at 11, she was sectioned and into a young person's mental health facility where they diagnosed bipolar disorder as well, ADHD and autism. And we couldn't actually have survived the way it was. It was heartache again for us and brokenness. And she had to go to a residential facility 300 miles from home in Wiltshire that was therapeutic. I can remember my husband standing in the kitchen, leaning against the kitchen units and crying his eyes out and just saying, I just will have to go and get her and just bring her home. And yet we couldn't. There's a child with mental health problems. I was a school teacher for years. I had quite a high-powered job, and I couldn't get her to school. She would bite me. She would hit me. She was so anxious about school. She wouldn't sleep. I went, the bipolar, I would be awake for weeks on end when she never slept. It was hard. And we loved her with all of our heart. And to take her to Wiltshire and to leave her there was, again, and we're saying, God, what is this brokenness? And I'm crying when I'm telling you, and I need to say that people look at revival, they look at moves of God, but I want to remind you of Gideon, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon and the broken vessels. There's a brokenness in our lives that permits the light to shine. And sometimes the path to revival, to reformation, it's not that we are embracing or saying it's the only way. For Ken and I, it's been our way. I remember once saying to the Lord, what is so stubborn in me that I need the bit in my mouth that you can steer me? But actually, I just think it adds to who we are. I would not have seen revival had God not broken in with the intimacy that we saw. And now we've got this new thing, but this new thing's destroying us and destroying the family. We were all involved with trying to survive life with this child that was, we could not see hope. I used to say, Ken, I'm actually going to die. I'm so exhausted. I just can't do this. And
Lois,
so
Lois, as I'm listening to you, there's 2 or 3 transitions there from, the environment, your church environment that you were brought up in, probably quite legalistic. Then there was the kind of, you moved from that into something fresh with Ken and the church plant and whatever. Then there's the prophetic word from Suzette Hatton. Like, I'm just seeing reservoirs of courage in you, because none of those decisions are easy, right? We know none of those decisions are easy. I mean, you having your experience that you had in your dad's church, and you're done with all that stuff, and then to have that public proclamation, prophetic word over you with Suzette, and then in Florida, in America, and you rise up to it, and then the whole baby in your arms, and wow.
but
Like
that
how
baby, she took us into what we're doing now.
okay.
We would not have Hope Spring. That baby was the sign of the new thing.
Okay.
Because what happened was she was incredibly intelligent, and it was brokenness. But she got her education, but it did not equip her for life. She would have ended up in all sorts of problems, etc. And I'm leading the prayer room while Ken's traveling, and I'm surrounded by a group of young people who come from university, and together, I'm telling you, God moved. They trained as speech and language therapists. They got degrees. They got my two daughters. One became a head teacher. One became a very acknowledged psychologist. They became the staff of what the new thing is Hope Spring. And so we minister. I'm saying minister. We serve these young people who have severe difficulties with either mental health, autism, gangs, and God was preparing us through her, because I learned what worked for her, and it was the therapeutic model that is unique. We are the only school in the world with that model, and we have been acknowledged by the British Psychological Society. We've won awards, but none of that would exist had we not gone on the journey of the baby and the new thing. We learned it all through her. And I need to say, she's married, she's successful, she's got a master's, she's on a PhD pathway.
Oh my gosh.
She is a miracle, and she loves Jesus. And
Wow.
so the new thing we are living in. So yes, it was. So that's how we moved to Reformation from revival.
So Lois, your story is incredible. I mean, I always knew it was incredible, but and you've just told a little bit more, kind of opened the curtain a bit, and it's remarkable. And man, I just want to honor you and honor Ken and everything that's happened.
Yeah.
But I just really feel like let's maybe just put a pin in this right now. And
okay,
Lois, what I'd like you to do, would you just speak to people right now that are listening to the solutionary stories and going, yeah, but you don't know where I'm at. I'm trying to be a solutionary, but I got all this stuff coming at me. And maybe I even want to quit. What would you say to somebody? And I got to tell you, Lois, as you're talking, I keep hearing the overcomers from Revelation 2 and 3. It's like, he who overcomes, blah, blah, blah. He overcomes, blah, blah, blah. Like, I just keep hearing that over and over again. So just speak to somebody today that needs to hear about staying strong, having that courage Ina was talking about, and overcoming today.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about overcoming. It didn't feel like we were overcomers at the time. I do feel that the main thing that happened was we actually, particularly me, fell in love with Jesus like I never had before. So yes, I'd grown up legalistic. I'd grown up, I knew I was a Christian, but this was very, very real out of the depths of my pain. So I would say to people, sometimes we don't realize it's a journey, and it's not just overcoming. It's something where Jesus is reaching out to us and just saying, come, because that's what it was for me. Now, without doubt, that finding him in a different, intimate way of love led us directly into revival move of God.
Yeah.
And that was where passion for Jesus was reignited to the thousands, and actually possibly hundreds of thousands of people who came to Sunderland. But it began with a broken little couple who weren't overcomers, who just found Jesus in an intimacy that we'd never had before. Because, the ministry can be quite performative. It is performative. Church can be that way. This was very different. And, I remember Ken saying, God asked him, Ken, how's your heart? And he said nobody'd asked him how his heart was. They'd asked him how many had his church, how many were coming on a Sunday morning, what the tithes were, what the finances were like.
Yeah.
But God asked him a different question. It was, how's your heart?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't necessarily overcoming. It was God pursuing our heart. And the Song of Solomon is all about the garden of your heart.
Yeah.
And the north wind blows just as the south wind blows. So you get the lovely warmth of the south wind, but sometimes in our lives we get the cold north wind. But both are necessary for the gardener to come and walk the garden with us to produce the garden of our heart.
Incredible.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
So good. So, Ian and Lois, this is remarkable. We're just going to, we've never done a part 1 and part 2, so this is exciting. Again, Lois, thank you for being so open.
Because I'm long-winded.
No. It was incredible. And so we're just going to not rush into more of the story. Let's just maybe park it here for today. And this will be the first time we've ever done a part 1 and part 2. So if you're listening today, and you are because you're hearing me, next week we're having Lois back to hear the rest of the story, some of the rest of the story of how Lois and Ken took this part of their journey and just kept moving forward. Whichever wind blew, they just kept moving forward. And so we're going to hear more of their story next week on Kingdomize the podcast.
Thanks for joining us today on Kingdomize the podcast. Let's keep the discussion going throughout the week on our socials or on our website, kingdomizeglobal.com. Contact us today to see how we can walk together to see more of God's kingdom in your city as it is in heaven.